Well, I was tricked. My wife and I talked about all kinds of things before we got married, and we said, hey, if God blesses us with children one day, we'd like to have more than one, and our oldest was a little over a year, and we started talking about timing for the second. She said, well, this could take anywhere from 6 months to a year for me to get pregnant. I said, okay. And 6 weeks later, she let me know she was pregnant, and I was like, well, surprise, surprise. A little faster than I was anticipating. Over the course of the pregnancy, hormones happen and changes happen. And one night, my wife looked at me and she was troubled. And I could tell that she was troubled. And this was one of those looks like I shouldn't just go to bed. And so I said, what's wrong? And she started to cry. And she said, I don't know if I can love our next child as much as I love our oldest. Now, I looked at her like she was completely out of her mind, because if you've met my wife for more than 10 seconds, you know how preposterous this idea was. I was a student pastor at the time, and I watched her love students more like just so incredible, and these weren't even her kids, and that's when we had our oldest, and I watched her love for him, and we moved on, and there was no question in my mind at all that she would love our next child just as much as she loved our oldest. And so I was as empathetic as I can be and just, tried to journey with her for 5 minutes, and I let her know, I have no concerns about this. I'm going to bed. So that's what I did. And the next morning, I got up, and I made a joke, like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to love that. And she was not ready for that humor at all. And that was made very apparent to me over the course of the next couple days, that she did not find that funny, and I should not joke about that. Well, I just let that kind of lie. And then a couple days after our youngest child was born, I looked at her and I said, are you still worried? And she said, not at all. I don't know how it's possible. Like, the love that I have for our oldest is matched by the love that I have for our youngest. Now, being married to me, my wife knows that anything that happens in our lives is pretty much licensed for me to share. That's just one of the agreements. My kids are now at the age at this point where I check with them. And one of my sons has said, use whatever you want anytime. The other one, not so much. Still have to check with him on the stories that I will tell. But I'm not an idiot. And so before I stand up here and share this story with everybody, I wanted to clear it to make sure this one was okay to share with everybody. And so I checked with my wife, and she said, absolutely. That was a real emotion. It was a real fear that I had. It was part of the process that God took me on as a parent. Feel free to share that story. But I wanted to share it with both of our kids as well and make sure that they were all right with it. And so I asked them, hey, would you be all right with me sharing this story? And cleared it as a family. And then my son said, well, Dad, what about you? Do you have enough love in your heart for both of us? To which I responded, depends on the day. Some days I love you more, some days I love you less. My love's conditional. Now, everyone in the car knew I was joking. And I still got in trouble. My wife did not find that funny at all. She did not find it even like the slightest bit of humor. Everyone in the car knew I was joking, and I still got in trouble for it. Because I guess there's just, love of a mother. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at motherhood, and we're going to see that God has designed it, and it's beautiful how He's designed it. And it can be incredibly challenging and heart-wrenching. And we're going to look at all the different aspects of it today, because the reality of being a parent and being a mother is far different than a Hallmark moment. It's a far different experience than a greeting card or pretending that everything's great. In fact, it can be heart-wrenching at times. It can be challenging. It can be a wide range of emotions, and that's what we're going to see today as we look at an example of motherhood in 1 Kings. So if you have your phones or your tablets, I'd invite you to follow along with us this morning in the Bible app. It's a free resource that you can find in whatever app store you utilize on your device. And once you have it installed on your device, there's a feature within the Bible app called the Events feature. Either enable your locations or write in Lakeside, Algoma, and we'll pop up and you can follow along with us that way. If you have a traditional Bible with you, we are in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 3, we're going to begin in verse 16 in just a minute. And if you're joining us via the stream this morning, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Brian. I'm part of the team here at Lakeside, and the verses will be available for you on the screen below. Now, before we dive in to 1 Kings chapter 3, beginning in verse 16, I just want to catch you up on the first part of 1 Kings chapter 3. There is a king, and his name is Solomon. And he cries out to God when he becomes king, God, give me wisdom. That is his prayer. He asks that God would grant him wisdom, and God does so. And then he gives him all kinds of other blessings as well. But God gives him wisdom, and that's how 1 Kings chapter 3 begins. And then we get to 1 Kings chapter 3, beginning in verse 16, where we dive in this morning, and we read these words. Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "O my Lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house." So we're setting up the scene. Here's King Solomon, and before him are 2 women whose job is a prostitute, and the prostitute says, hey, we both live together. We're not sure if this was a brothel or if this was a different kind of living arrangement where they shared a home together. We're not entirely sure, but this is the reality of what is happening. And the woman who's speaking before the king gave birth to a son. That's the setup to what's going on. And then we get to verse 18. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house, only we 2 were in the house. 3 days later, the other woman gives birth as well. So we have a situation where there are 2 single moms. 2 single moms in the same house with their 2 sons. This is the circumstance. So 2 single mothers, they have 2 newborn sons with them. And then we get to verse 19. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And your heart just breaks reading it. That here this other woman lost her child. She rolled over and suffocated him in the course of the night as they were laying together, and it's every parent's worst fear confirmed. There's a child who is now dead. A horrible instance of child loss. And the reality is, some of you have been there. And there is something within your soul that you hate this day because this day is a reminder of that which you have endured. And it doesn't matter whether it was the excitement of going to see how the baby was growing, only to see the look of concern on the technician's face, and then the horrified look on the doctor's face as they come in and they break the news that we couldn't find the heartbeat. It doesn't matter if you carry the child to term and give birth only to discover that the child has passed away. It doesn't get any easier if you get the knock on the door that your teenager has had a horrific accident. Or if you get the call from your fully grown child that there is no cure. The pain and the loss and how it rips you apart that no parent should ever have to endure. And here in the midst of this circumstance, that is where we are. A little child suffocated and died. And Gone are the dreams of the breakfasts that would be made, staring out the kitchen window, seeing them play in the yard, watching as they learned to drive, went off to their prom all dressed up. The excitement that you would feel as you watch your son fall in love and start a family one day as he marries a woman, and then the joy as they welcome a child and you become a grandma. That's where the real fun starts. And all of those dreams, all those plans are wiped away in an instant. As you were just laying with your child, and then in the course of the night, the most horrific thing possible happened. And the child is now gone. And verse 20 tells us, as she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me, while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. This woman who's just lost her child, now in the midst and in the throes of her grief, goes and takes the child who is still alive and claims the child who is still alive as her own child, and leaves her dead child with the other mother. She kidnaps a child in the midst of her grief. And some of you have experienced horrific events around your child that no child should ever have to endure. And you've watched as they've been taken, or as someone has assaulted them, and you felt so hopeless and you felt so powerless. When I rose in the morning, verse 21 says, to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born. And now this woman is experiencing the grief of losing a child, and the worst has happened. And as she cries out, and as she begins to process, and as she begins to cry out to God, no, this can't be. There's got to be something else. And she's holding her child, and she looks closely. And as she's shaking and wiping away the tears, she says, wait a minute, this isn't my child. The ability for a mom to know her children. And it strikes her that this is not her child. But the other woman, verse 22 said, no, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, no, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. And now here we are in the midst of loss, in the midst of grief, in the midst of kidnapping, in the midst of all of this strife. Between these two moms, there is jealousy, and there is a rivalry, and there is a dual claim on a child, and we certainly don't see many cases like that in our society in terms of this, but we see many cases of that every single day in our court system. As vows that promised forever fall apart. And the design that God made for marriage to be permanent between a man and a woman falls apart. And there is the collateral damage oftentimes. And it's the children. And we would love to say that in every case, the sole desire of both parties is for what's best for the children. But the reality is they can become a bargaining chip. There you are, in the throes of hurt, in the throes of loss, in the throes of anger, and sometimes rage and pain, and the kids are caught up. And you have a lawyer who's advocating for you, but let's be honest, also billing you by the hour, and a judge who's tasked with trying to decide the best, but let's be honest, overworked on their caseload, and you're just another binder. Another file to them. And there are the children being argued over. And even if the best outcome is found in your favor, there's still the hurt and the pain and the difficulty of the circumstance and the situation. This is where we are. This is the reality that many people face in this journey of motherhood. Yes, it is beautiful, but it is challenging. It is difficult. And we're not done seeing the reasons why. Verse 23, then the king said, the one says, this is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. So Solomon, he summarizes the claims that have been presented to him. Now, as we mentioned earlier, in 1 Kings chapter 3, he asked God that God would grant him wisdom. And God does so, so much so that he was the wisest person who ever lived. And yet, now he's presented with this heart-wrenching, very challenging case that would certainly stick with him for the rest of his life, and it's now recorded for us for all eternity. That he is now the one who has to preside over this dispute. These two moms warring for this child. Then we get to verse 24, and the king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. Again, 1 Kings chapter 3 starts with Solomon asking for wisdom and God granting him all the wisdom in the world, making him the wisest person ever. I'm not sure how you think this scene should unfold, but when I think about ways to, decide what's best for the child, I'm just going to read verse 24 again. And the king said, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. This is not the direction I thought that would go. And then it gets worse. In verse 25. And the king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. This seems like there is nothing wise about this. In fact, it seems like if we could go the unwisest course of action, we've arrived there. And then we get to verse 26. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. And here we see the sacrifice of a mom. That all those dreams and all those aspirations, the plans that she had planned, the things that she had desired, all those things that she had wanted to experience with her child, she's willing to give away because it's for what's best for the child. And that is such a foundational aspect of motherhood and of parenthood. that there is sacrifice that is demanded. And sometimes it's in really big cases like this. Frequently, it's in the much smaller. The joy of the first dance recital and the first t-ball game. And how exciting that was. And now, on your 73rd weekend of dance and travel ball, you're over it. You never want to see another stupid dance routine or baseball pitched again in your life. Because you're wondering, what's happened to my life? When do I ever get to do what I want to do? The promotion at work that you couldn't even apply for because you needed to have the flexibility to take care of your kid at a moment's notice. And the requirements in the new position wouldn't offer that. And you know you're qualified. And you know you would be exceptional in that role. But because of the dynamic of raising a family, it can't be your reality. And what you sacrifice and what you put aside for the benefit of your child. To know that sometimes as a parent and sometimes as a mother, what you want for your kid isn't ultimately what they desire. And so having to let go of what you want to see them accomplish and succeed at what they want. And you think back to all of the things that you did for them. All of the sacrifices you made along the way, and here they are, and it seems like they're not even factoring you into the equation, and you start to wrestle with resentment, and you start to wrestle with, well, they should be more grateful, and they should have more gratitude. And it's sacrifice. That you lay down your own desires to see them achieve and acquire what they ultimately want to achieve. Frequently, it's in the small things. Sometimes it's in the really large. And here is this mother of a newborn child on this journey of motherhood, and the king says, cut the baby in two, and she knows it's her son. And her response is give him to the other woman. Let her dreams die in that moment because it's what's best for the child. Then the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Solomon was never going to cut the child in half. He was never going to hurt the baby. But he made the right decision, and all of Israel marveled at that decision that day. We love to look at the highlights of being a mother, and there is much to celebrate. There is much to be joyful about. But that's not the complete story of motherhood and of parenthood in general. And some of you hate today. You hate today because it's a reminder for what you prayed about for years and years and what you desired for so long. And the amount of time and the amount of money you spent on doctors and treatments with the hope that this time the result would be different. Only to find out you're unable to conceive. And then you wrestle with, is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with my husband? Is there something wrong with us? God, why wouldn't you listen to my prayers? God, why would you give children to some of the people you give children to and not to us? And it's fertile soil for bitterness and resentment and misunderstanding to just be planted within you. And the relationship with your spouse begins to struggle. You question, God, what are you doing? What is happening? And the sexual relationship that is meant for mutual fulfillment and joy within the context of marriage is now strained, and there's resentment that is just falling in every aspect of the relationship. No, you hate today because it's a reminder what you so desperately wanted. You begin to process and question all these things in your mind. Others, it's because of the loss that we spoke of. And it doesn't matter whether it's the news that the heartbeat can't be found or whether it's an adult. There's the pain of losing a child that impacts a parent and it cuts deep. Or for some, it's tragedy. Your child has had to endure things no child should ever have to endure. Horrific acts. And you start to question, you start to wonder, where did I fail? Why couldn't I protect them? And you feel so helpless as you just hear of the assault that your child endured in these events that no child should ever have to go through, and it tears you apart. And you start to question, what's wrong with me? Or you don't find out about it for a while, and you question, why couldn't this be an environment where somebody would come to me right away? And you begin to question all of these things, and it just shreds you to your core. Emotional toll. The pictures that you still look at, where they would smile. And they were so happy. And then something changed. And you can't even put your finger on it, but that child that was so happy as a kid, they're bitter now. And they're angry. And every day is a fight, and you're just exhausted. So you don't just fight about big things, you fight about stupid things. And you give them a directive, and they act persecuted. And you're just tired of it all, and you want to snap. Or that used to be your reality. And then in the process of all that, the distance grew. So there is no relationship anymore. And those pictures that you have are the only reminder. You don't know the last time you talked. You haven't stayed in touch. And it's not for your lack of trying. You want to. You do anything you could just to have a conversation. Just to try to go back and say, I don't know where it all fell apart. But can we just find some common ground? They won't even take your call. And that cuts you to the core. Because they frustrate you and they make you angry, but there's a love for them that is within you that you can't even fully describe. And the distance just needs to be fixed, but they don't want to fix it. And so it stays there. And the sacrifice that is required. And you want them to accomplish their dreams. You want them to see the things that they desire be a reality in their life. But somewhere along the way, you lost yourself in the process. And there's a little bit of resentment. But you can't talk to anybody about that resentment because you want to present the picture-perfect family. And so instead of talk to anybody about that resentment, you just push it down and you push it down and you just continue to bottle it up inside of you until one day it just explodes. And you think they will never appreciate everything I have done for them. And there's anger and resentment that happens as a result. And there's an incredible desire for your kids to thrive. You want them to experience their best. You want them to experience God's best in their life. You've done everything you can to point them to the process of following after Jesus. And yet their hearts seem far from God. And it rips you apart as you want them to experience what it's like to have a vibrant faith. To follow Jesus. And you recognize they can't live off of your faith. Your faith can be used as a guide for them, but they have to accept it and embrace it for themselves. And it seems like they aren't interested. It seems like they don't care. This is the reality of motherhood. It is a beautiful thing. But there are challenges in every step of the way. And so what we must be as a community is we must be a place where people can be honest about their struggles and they could feel like they don't have to walk through these things alone. That in the uncertainty of an inability to conceive, the heart-wrenching reality of the loss of a child, that when someone's family endures tragedy and the struggle of the emotional toll, when you're exhausted from sacrifice and possess a desire for your kids that they don't possess for themselves. In all of those moments, the lie of the enemy is you can't talk about that with anyone. You have to go through that alone. You have to go through that in a prison of isolation. because nobody will understand and other people will judge you. And sometimes people will come alongside of you and they're really well-meaning, but they'll say really stupid things. Like if you've ever lost a child and they come up to you and they're like, well, God just needed them more than you did. What are you talking about? So you withdraw. You think, I've got to do this myself. And the reality of living in a broken and a flawed world is all of this goes against God's original design. But God is greater than our pain and our circumstances, and no one should walk through these things alone. So our hope and our prayer is that we could come alongside of you. And we could put you in community with people who have experienced what you are experiencing and have seen how God can redeem the heartache and the hurt and the challenges and use even those things for His glory. God, we thank you for the gift, parenthood, for motherhood especially. And Lord, I pray right now for the person whose desire was to have children and who never got to experience that dream. God, I pray that they would not believe the lie of the enemy, that a child would determine their worth or their value. I pray they wouldn't feel imprisoned to go through that alone. Pray for everyone who's lost a child and the pain that never goes away. And I pray, God, the hope of Jesus and resurrection would be that which encourages them. That your Spirit would guide and comfort them in the midst of their grief and loss. Pray, God, for those who are walking through tragedy. And as they look around and they're asking, God, how can you let this happen? They wouldn't turn their back on you in the midst of their confusion. They wouldn't feel like they have to go through that journey alone. Pray for the kids right now caught up in custody disputes. And as they feel the tension of loving two parents but being pulled apart, God, I pray you'd sustain them. And I pray that you'd be with their parents as they're processing anger and hurt and rage and bitterness and confusion. God, just work in those circumstances. Pray for the families that aren't even speaking any longer. There's just so much anger. And I pray, God, that you would soften the hearts of all the parties involved. There could be reconciliation and restoration there. I pray for the parents who are tired. Sacrificed so much. God, we pray that you would sustain them. And I pray that each person would know that they don't have to walk through that alone. Let us be the community that rallies around one another and collectively points one another to you, Jesus. Be honored and glorified in the mess of our circumstances. May we live for you. It's in your name we pray.